Now, for this upcoming conversation, I am very, very excited to introduce you to our speakers. First up, we have Zara Chaudhry, who is one of the absolute rock stars from our DEI team, and she's going to be joined in conversation by Shona Louise. Now, Shona is an LGBTQ plus disabled freelance writer, photographer, and accessibility consultant, as well as an activist. Shona, Zara, I cannot wait to hear this conversation, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you two. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Meg. Hi, Shona, and welcome to the summit. We're so glad to have you here to talk about disability inclusion and LGBTQ plus spaces. To start off, can you tell us a bit about you and your work?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this. So as you all have heard, I do many jobs, but it all kind of begun from starting a blog when I was 14 years old. Living with a rare genetic condition, I kind of felt isolated at school. And so I found this community online that I really connected with, and everything kind of built from there. I got into writing a little bit and started writing for charities, and then getting kind of the odd paid job from it. And that kind of built up. And as my kind of disability progressed, I was kind of facing more and more barriers in life. And so I began talking about them as well, and trying to kind of fight the barriers that I was sort of facing, and also raising awareness with people as well, because I was often finding that it wasn't that people were being purposefully ignorant about things, it's just they had no idea how difficult life could be. And so the writing side of it came from that. And then I also heavily work within the theatre industry in the UK. So both as a freelance photographer, which I adore and kind of really like to get my creative side out, but also as an accessibility consultant. So looking at theatres and the way they operate and how we can kind of better serve disabled people, and also all minorities as well, making sure that everyone is represented and heard and recognised. So yeah, kind of doing many different things there. And also the activism side of it, I feel like, as someone who's disabled and LGBTQ plus, it's kind of just a constant thing of kind of, if I want to live the best life I can, kind of the activism goes hand in hand with that. So, you know, it's not only fighting for everyone's needs, but also kind of on a personal level as well, to kind of live the life that I want to live. You kind of have to be an activist.
I love that. Thank you so much for being so vulnerable, and also for sharing like where you know, it's amazing that it started from like blog writing, you know, and really like fueled you being such a passionate activist today. That's amazing. So I know you mentioned sort of the intersection of disability as well as being a member of the LGBTQ plus community. So I know you live with a genetic condition called Marfan syndrome, and you use a power chair to get around. How is your experience at this intersection of disability and being, you know, part of the LGBTQ plus community? How is that experience unique from folks who might still be a part of the LGBTQ plus community, but don't identify as disabled?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a lot more different than people think, because when I was kind of figuring out my sexuality, I kind of genuinely believed that I'd kind of ticked my minority box being disabled, and I couldn't be anything more than that, because I didn't see the representation. I really did not know that disabled LGBTQ plus people even existed. You know, when I was growing up, there was no representation in the media at all. You know, there was kind of growing disability representation and growing LGBTQ plus representation, but there was never an intersection of that. And so I really believed that these people just didn't exist, and therefore, even though I was feeling all of these things, that couldn't possibly be kind of the outcome of it. And so it really started there with figuring out my sexuality, and kind of also kind of the intersection of being a woman. And, you know, at first I identified as bisexual because I was like, well, I can't not like men, like that's what is expected of me. And so again, then it took more time to kind of come to the realization that I don't like men at all, and kind of I identify as queer mostly, but use the label lesbian as well sometimes. And it took a long time to kind of come to that conclusion because of all these kind of steps and barriers in the way, and just not having that representation at all. And it was kind of thanks to social media really that I'd begun to see that representation, and that helped massively in kind of working out who I was. But then you get into the LGBTQ plus community, and then you realize that actually there's even more barriers, because there are so many accessibility problems, especially where I am in the UK. I'm just outside of London, and kind of 90% of London's sort of queer venues are inaccessible. You know, they were built underground at a time where there was even more stigma, and they've just not really been updated since. And so kind of I wasn't able to access my community in person. All of my interaction was online. And even when I went to Pride in London for the first time, you know, there were so many barriers. And I remember there being a particular moment where there were staff there who'd specifically been assigned to look after accessibility and to support any disabled people there. And there were kind of barriers in front of the sort of the curb cutouts. And so we asked if they could move them, and they just kind of said no. And it just kind of blew my mind a little bit that that's specifically what they've been hired to do. And I think that kind of sums up a little bit the inaccessibility problem within the community at the moment. And kind of people always say to me, oh, but kind of the LGBTQ plus community is so inclusive, it must be so welcoming. And in some ways it is, but in other ways, I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of make sure that we are welcoming people who belong to sort of several identities and groups.
Yeah, I love that you were able to even just share such specific examples of like barriers and challenges that you've seen. So I know that earlier you had mentioned that you are an access consultant in the theater industry, which by the way is like super cool. Did not even know that that existed. That's awesome. And clearly it's needed, right? Like you already mentioned quite a few barriers that you see. So I know you started touching upon it, but I'm just curious to sort of hear from you. Do you have any other observations that you've made about accessibility within LGBTQ plus spaces that you haven't already mentioned that you'd like to kind of bring into this conversation?
Yeah, I think the point where we're at is it's still kind of not even thought of. Like I'll kind of look to attend an event or, you know, community event, something like that, and there'll be kind of like a general, like this event is wheelchair accessible, and you think, great, amazing, I'll be able to go. And then you get there and the reality is just so different, because they've not consulted with disabled people, they've not talked to disabled people, there's been no input from anyone with a lived experience. And so you get there and there's no accessible toilet, or it's really crowded, or there's loads of tables in the way, or there are tables that are not at the right height to sit at. And it's kind of these little things that build up. So like, even if I can get into a space, when I'm in that space, do I feel comfortable? Do I feel thought of and included? You know, do I feel like there has been some thought process behind it, rather than kind of a tick box exercise at the end of it, which is often how it feels, that kind of someone's gone, oh God, we should probably think about accessibility, and they've kind of done the best they can, rather than thinking about that at the start of the process, talking to disabled people, you know, working with access consultants and things like that. Because I find if you can have a conversation with someone, then they get it, but it's making that conversation happen that I think is so difficult at the moment, and just trying to get in that room and get your voice heard and kind of feel heard. And that's kind of a big thing that I think a lot of disabled people in the LGBTQ community lack right now. It's that feeling of being heard and being recognized and feeling like your needs are being met, and not feeling like an inconvenience, like you're asking for too much, because that's a big thing as well. It's kind of, these are such simple things that we should be doing, but because it's not normalized, because it's not sort of in people's habit, it feels like you're asking for so much, when in reality all you're asking for is what everyone else already has.
Yeah, I really like that you kind of flagged that for us. You know, it's not like you're asking for anything extra, but yet sometimes it feels that way because we've kind of like internalized that. That's such a powerful sentiment to bring into this. Have you noticed that like more folks are reaching out to you or to other folks in terms of accessibility? I'm just curious, like, is that something that now people are a little bit more aware of?
Yeah, I think it's getting there. It's kind of been a slow improvement over the past sort of 5 years, I'd say. And it's kind of frustrating that it's been slow, but also you want to celebrate that at the same time, right, and recognize any progress we're making, because I think that's important. And for a long time as a sort of disabled activist, I was quite negative and sort of not keen to praise when you know, it was due because it wasn't enough, it wasn't perfect. And I think it's really important that actually we do praise when improvements are made, even if it's not up to the standard that we want at the moment, because that's how the conversations happen, and that's how we keep progress moving, is by recognizing these things and kind of interacting with people. I think kind of there are difficult conversations to be had that perhaps people don't want to have, but once you've had that conversation, you know, things improve massively. And kind of accessibility is not as scary as people think. You know, it's just if you ask someone who has that lived experience, then it all becomes quite easy.
Yeah. And, you know, I like that you still push for the small celebrations are so important, you know, like we'll continue to fight tomorrow, but it's okay for us to celebrate today. I think that is really important. And, you know, thank you for being honest that like before you weren't always, you know, it can be really frustrating because it's like, okay, this small thing happened, but it's not enough. So I appreciate you kind of flagging like, no, we should celebrate, and we continue to push for even more progress, but we do celebrate the little progress. So when you're thinking about companies on a larger scale, and really when we're thinking about accessibility, like what do companies need to do to ensure accessibility of their LGBTQ plus networks?
Talk to disabled people. I think that is kind of the, you know, people ask me all the time, how can things improve sort of across the board in loads of different communities and areas, and the answer always is talk to disabled people, because I think people try and have a go themselves. They make assumptions about what people need, and then by the time it gets to the event or the day or whatever, and you know, it's wrong and it's too late and it can't be fixed. Whereas if you engage with disabled people at the start of that process, then you won't have that at the end. You know, I talk a lot in theatre accessibility about solving problems before the customer even knows it's a problem. And that's kind of the goal here, that we are solving problems before anyone is even aware that it ever was a problem. And not only talking to disabled people and engaging with them, but also paying them, because that's a big issue as well. And, you know, I have a lot of requests for working for free in terms of accessibility consultant, and kind of little nuggets of advice given here and there, but it adds up and it's a lot of personal sacrifice to be able to do that. And, you know, we deserve to be paid for our work. And I think kind of paying a disabled person to give that kind of advice, to be an access consultant, is kind of the best kind of disability positive thing you can do, because it shows that you respect their time, that you respect their advice. And that's really important in feeding into this whole feeling heard and feeling seen. You know, when you are respected within your community and you feel like you're being listened to, that's when we can kind of begin to say that we're being inclusive.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, you know, I'm on the DEIB team at Power to Fly. So like we're seeing trends happen in DEIB as well. And one of them is definitely like pushing to pay people for the work. If you're going to have someone, you know, give you guidance about their lived experience, you should be compensating them, you know. So I'm glad that you brought that into this conversation as well. I think that's such an important key. We shouldn't be expecting free emotional labor from folks, you know. So I appreciate you kind of naming that like compensation is really important. And also what you named about assumptions. I think there's so much danger that can happen in making assumptions, and then you end up causing more harm. Whereas, you know, if you had just proactively, like you named, spoke to someone around accessibility, like you could have prevented that from happening instead of operating off assumptions. So I also appreciate you flagging that in this conversation as well. So where can our audience access your writing on this subject to learn more? Because I know you mentioned you started off with writing, yes. And I can only imagine that, like, you know, it's gotten like that much more widespread. So where can audiences really kind of access it?
Yeah, so my blog is still running. It's been 10 years now, wow. Still going. And although I don't write on there myself as much anymore, all of my sort of content that I've written for elsewhere is available there. So it's just shonalouise.com. And you can kind of find everything there, and there's a lot more on sort of theatre accessibility as well. I think especially if anyone is interested in kind of the way the UK works with that, because I know that I'm always really interested about sort of Broadway accessibility and how that differs, and kind of the differences in laws between kind of the two countries as well. I think that's really fascinating. So it's kind of all on there, and yeah, it's really nice that after 10 years my blog is still going, and people kind of ask, you know, would you ever stop it? And I don't think I would. I think it's it's been the start of the journey for me. So I will always keep it there, I think.
And so I know you work mostly within the theater industry, but like, do you get requests outside of the theater industry? And are there any like unique requests that you've gotten? I'm just curious, like, as people are really starting to proactively, hopefully, think about accessibility, like, I'm just curious to kind of see like, what are the types of requests you get outside of the theater industry?
Yeah, so it differs a lot. Sort of 90% of my work is within theatre, I'd say, but you do kind of, and it, unfortunately, the kind of requests that I get outside of that tend to be the unpaid ones, and tend to be people kind of DMing me on Twitter or, you know, things like that, asking kind of, I'm running this event, I really want to make it accessible, what do I do? And it makes you feel really torn, I think, because I really want to be proactive and be like, we need to be paying people for their time. But also within me, I'm also like, well, if I don't give this advice, who is going to? And if they don't, then, you know, whatever is happening, it just won't be accessible. And then, you know, you kind of take on the guilt for that, which is wrong. But like, I think as an activist, it's kind of like an automatic thing. And it's a really hard line to kind of toe and to recognize that I should be being paid for my time, but also if I don't give this advice, then there are kind of real life consequences for that, and no progress will have been made at all. So a lot of the requests I get outside of theatre are kind of those more like casual questions and things like that. And, you know, I'm happy to kind of give a little bit of time and answer a few questions, but kind of after like the third or fourth email, I start to be like, okay, this is turning into a job now for which you should be paying me.
No, absolutely, 100%. And I think you really, you know, hit the nail on the head there, where it's like that tricky balance of like, I want to help, you know, this person grow, or like, you know, help this event be accessible. But then on the flip side, it's like, but then it's that free emotional labor that we were talking about. So I love that you have some sort of boundary there. You know, it's the third or fourth email where you're then like gonna push back on that. I appreciate that, especially if anyone else in the audience might be kind of struggling with that. I think it's good to have a boundary there, like you kind of named.
Yeah, definitely. I think boundaries are really important, and it's something it took a long time to learn. And I think anyone involved in activism or on social media, especially these days, setting yourself boundaries is really important, because the amount of times I've sort of burnt out in the past from kind of fighting things because it felt like I was the only person that would fight it is really difficult to balance. But kind of setting those boundaries has benefited me so much. And, you know, kind of I've been surprised by people's reactions. Actually, I thought that people would react negatively, but actually for the most part, people have been really chill with it and like, yeah, that's, you know, absolutely fine. You know, this is your emotional time. It's, you know, you're sacrificing here. So I think if you're scared to kind of set those boundaries, kind of start small, but also it's really important to protect yourself and to protect your time. And kind of as an activist, don't feel like you have to fight every single battle. I think especially as a disabled person and someone who's also LGBTQ plus, there are so many things that come up in my everyday life that I could be fighting, but I can't give my energy to everything. And so I think you kind of have to start picking and choosing which conversations to have, which ones are going to be the most productive, and setting those boundaries.
100%. It's also just like you mentioned, like protecting your energy, you know, like you can't do everything. So really having those boundaries is going to be very important. I'm also really happy to hear that people respond well to that. I think a lot of times, I mean, it seems like people just don't know. So it's not until you flag it for them where you're like, hey, actually, you know, this is taking up more of my time, that people then realize, because I think sometimes they're so focused on just like getting the answer. So just like even flagging that for them, I'm happy to hear that people have been responding positively to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wanted to go back to what you were talking about with writing, because I think writing is definitely a big outlet for many people. And it definitely helps your mental health, right? Because you're sharing, you're processing your feelings. My question is, what is your advice for people who are LGBTQ plus and struggling with their mental health due to disability and exploring opportunities? Like, what would be your advice, especially when it comes to writing?
So it's kind of a double-edged sword, but I think social media has a massive part to play. And I think kind of, again, the boundaries coming in there with social media especially, but it is where you're going to find the most diverse, inclusive community that is going to be welcoming. You know, I've connected with people who are really good friends now. And it's really nice to be able to reach out to a community that understands what you're going through. And, you know, I think writing especially is incredibly powerful in that, you know, I'll read articles from friends and go, wow, I didn't realize other people were dealing with this or struggling with this. And it's incredibly powerful. But again, social media is such a double-edged sword. And I think it's really important to protect yourself and your boundaries and to kind of make sure you're comfortable with everything. I think at the start of blogging and social media, I was a massive oversharer. And kind of over the years, I've reined it back a little bit now. And I think especially as a disabled person on social media, you kind of feel like you have to share your whole medical history. You know, the amount of questions that I get from people about my condition, things like that. And at the start, I was kind of like, well, I want to raise awareness and, you know, I want to share this experience. But actually, as time goes by, you kind of realize that you don't need to give your whole medical history to a stranger on the internet. And it's kind of really important to protect that, I think. But yeah, there is just this incredible, vibrant community on social media that has just made me feel so included and seen and heard, and, you know, kind of reaching across the world, you know, people that I never would have interacted with before. And I've kind of learned so much, and I grow every single day from just having kind of my social media feed full of so much diversity and people raising things and asking questions and, you know, kind of talking about things that I never would have interacted with in my day-to-day life. I feel like I've learned so much as a result of kind of immersing myself in that.
I was just about to say, social media can, like you said, is totally a double-edged sword. And like, there's so much learning opportunity there too. Like you were just mentioning, like, you know, interacting with people or having discussions that maybe you didn't even think about before. So I do think there's such opportunity there. But like you said, you have to be really careful. You have to really protect yourself on social media for sure. So we did have a question come in from someone. And they said, hi, Shona, I am a student and I want to ask that being on this side of living with a disability for all my life, but also growing up in a place where even coming out to your parents is challenging, what would you advise I do?
It's
a heavy question, I know.
Yeah. So advise on kind of coming out, is that the question?
That's what it seems like. I think just advising on potentially coming out, but also I would also like expand that and really just even navigating that whole experience.
Yeah, I think kind of taking things at your own pace is really important. I think kind of being surrounded by so many stories, I think especially with coming out, I think we've kind of built it up to be this huge, massive thing, and it always has to be a massive thing, when actually it can be more of a slow process, and you can come out to people sort of one by one as you feel comfortable and ready to do that. And I think the same goes for disability as well, kind of sharing what you're comfortable with. You know, kind of a lot of the kind of things that are involved in my life are really vulnerable conversations, and it's kind of slowly building up to have those conversations with people and kind of testing the waters, I guess, as well. But yeah, I think don't feel like you are rushed to have this massive moment, or feel like if you don't have this massive moment, then you've not done it right, or things like that. I think there's a lot of pressure on coming out these days, and also pressure to sort of label yourself immediately and get it right first time. I think we don't give, you know, people enough space to kind of to learn and grow and to, you know, figure out who they are on their own time. There is no race to kind of to know who you are immediately. I think it's a process that takes your whole life. You know, I don't think we can ever at any point in our lives go, I 100% know who I am. I think that's a good thing. I think we should give ourselves space to grow and to change. So yeah, I say don't feel any pressure. You know, I think especially looking on social media, kind of, I think these kind of like viral moments and stories can add a lot of pressure to things, but just take things at your pace. And if that is, you know, snail pace, really slow, then that's absolutely fine.
Thank you so much for that, Shona, and just like reminding us to have grace with ourselves. And also like what you said, it's not a specific timeline, you know, everyone kind of operates things differently. So I know we are coming up on time. I have really enjoyed our conversation. You are so inspiring. And so I just wanted to kind of ask if you have any final words that you'd kind of like to share with our audience about all of your work, or just in general, just some final inspirational words from you.
Yeah, I think I would just encourage people to kind of, in their everyday lives, kind of think about disability a little bit more. You know, I think if you are going to an event or in your workplace and you see something and you think that's, you know, it could be more accessible, we could be doing better, take it upon yourself to do something about that. I think don't leave it all to disabled people to be the ones to have to raise those questions and to make the changes. If you see something that's not right and you have the emotional time and, you know, the energy to do that yourself, then please do, because it takes it off our plate. And, you know, I think we kind of have to move away from this whole sort of, well, if an issue is affecting a disabled person, then it's disabled people's responsibility to fix that, because it's all of our responsibilities. So I think, you know, it would go a long way if people just kind of looked at their spaces and, you know, their environments and kind of just thought a little bit more about, you know, what could improve, what could be better.
Thank you so much for that, Shona, and also just like encouraging us all to be advocates. I think that's really powerful. We did have a final question come in from the audience that I think might be really great for you to quickly touch upon, which is that I've heard different terms used to describe individuals with disabilities, such as disabled, non-able-bodied, people with disabilities. My question is, what verbiage is most inclusive?
Yeah, so I think it's different, especially from the UK to the US. But I think in general, I've seen conversations, you know, on sort of both sides, that a lot of people try and shy away from the word disabled these days, and we use different words instead that we think are softer or gentler. But it just makes kind of disability look like it's a bad, scary thing. And I think using the word disabled is really empowering, because disability doesn't have to be negative, it can be positive. You know, my life is so much better because I am who I am today, and I would not change that. And so when people use these different words, it kind of makes me feel like I should be ashamed of being disabled and it's a bad thing. I think there's nothing wrong with the word disabled, and, you know, you're going to meet people who have a personal preference, and it's really important to recognize that and respect that. But I think in general, we shouldn't be scared of the word. And, you know, I think that's what a lot of kind of the disabled people I interact with would agree with.
Thank you so much for that, Shona. And like you said, I'm really holding on to being an advocate, right? And not like relying on people to have to advocate for themselves. Thank you so much for taking time today to really share your expertise. I can't wait to check out more of your writing, as you mentioned, on your website. So thank you again for being here and for spending some time chatting about this important work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.